morning. Welcome to Satan. And this time, yes, Satan and coffee. Not like last night where I fucked up and called apocryphal Satan and coffee. Hope everyone is doing well. There we go. So yeah, I hope everyone is doing amazingly. Having a wonderful weekend. Eternally beautiful weekend. Brown blur. I gotta figure out why. I need some lighting behind me so it doesn't get all fucking grainy and nasty and shit. It's just nasty back there. Me, like the way the camera. You can see it's just the grain is dancing because it could barely, like, the camera can barely focus on it. So, this morning we begin as we always begin. We reject the Trinity. We reject the baptism of John, and we reject the baptism of the Spirit. Hail thyself. This morning, what we're going to be talking about is the myth of enlightenment. And what I mean by the myth of enlightenment is I don't mean that enlightenment doesn't exist, but rather, as with all things, for some reason, cultists, neo-occultists, fucking just new age dimwits like to come in and roll in and take everything over and overdo the shit. I hope y'all got your coffee. I'm rocking my favorite cup. What a wonderful nightmare. The Nightmare Before Christmas, because Tim Burton, why not? Okay. 500 milliliters of enough caffeine to kill a fucking elephant. So, enlightenment. It has become its own religion in these modern times, as anything and everything has. Right? And I'm going to be completely honest here. I'm getting a little bit sick and tired of needing to come through and explain this shit. That, like, people just fall in line with this stuff, like that they don't, you know what I mean? That they don't research it. Like, I mean, for fuck's sake, I mean, is it that hard to, like, look some shit up, like, before you kind of dive into it, And it's a balance, right? It's everything that we do is a balance. We don't want people reading books and regurgitating what other people have said and, other people's power and ability and stuff like that. We don't want that. But at the same time, we also don't want people never to pick up a book and research shit either. Why do I have to be the one that sits here and explains to people, stop going to the extremes? Like, find a fucking balance in your life. Please. Like, why must we always go to one extreme or the other? I don't know. But so let's talk about definition and origins first and foremost. Enlightenment. What is enlightenment? Or how are we defining enlightenment, right? In this particular, concept and idea, right? So enlightenment appears in two worlds. Philosophical enlightenment, so we're talking 18th century reason, progress, right? Secularism. Spiritual enlightenment, so Eastern mysticism, self-realization, right? Both claim to lead to truth, but both demand submission to systems of control, right? Lucifer is the counter symbol here. The adversarial light, not the moralized one. When we talk about enlightenment, many people like to use enlightenment to provide or access a moral superiority, over others. I am enlightened. You are not. And that's not okay. Right? So, what we're going to be going through is we're going to be talking about this enlightenment, the enlightenment that is encroaching on belief here. We're going to talk about reason, spirituality, the whole modern self-help thing, and they all carry that same hidden chain: submission, right? Having someone submit to you or you to someone else. So, the 17th and 18th century Europe, right? So the rebellion against the church's monopoly on truth, right? So we got Voltaire, Kant, right? Diderot, Locke, Descartes, right? Trinity, good morning, and hail. Right? So dare to know, right? Sabereadu, right? Dare to know. And within that, the age of reason, right? Claimed to liberate humanity from superstition. But it replaced one priesthood, the church, with another: science, academia, bureaucracy, right? Enlightenment in man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, right? Immanuel Kant, right? What is enlightenment? So we force ourselves into boxes. So the age of reason claimed to liberate us. It freed us from the church's superstitious ways, right? We laughed in the face of the church. And, how they claimed that mental illness was demonic possession and, killed hundreds of people because they were witches, but they weren't. And so this era brought us closer to, science, academia, learning, the bureaucracy of everything, right? Of how things work. Right? So who defines immaturity here? Who decides when you've emerged? Right? Where does that come from? Where does that decision come from? So the dialect of enlightenment, who look at that, myth never dies, it just evolves. Right? Rationality becomes its own mythology. Sacred logic that punishes dissent. And that's kind of like what we're falling into with enlightenment. This idea of being enlightened. We get so enlightened that nothing makes any fucking sense. Right? Everything is and isn't at the same time. Right? Like this whole concept of that, like, everything is in existence and happening simultaneously, but at the same time, absolutely nothing is happening. And there is nothing that we can do to do anything. The body that we live in is just a vessel, and we must know everything. But the truth of the matter is we can know nothing. First thing you need to learn is that for everything that you do learn, you know nothing. I know nothing. Because what we know changes and evolves with the interjection of new information, right? New ideas, new concepts. And what we believe we know is constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly growing. Enlightenment isn't a singular state of being. It's a process. I feel my opinion on enlightenment is the understanding that I don't know shit and I'm always learning. I am a student and a teacher, and everyone that comes into my life is also a student and teacher. That I can learn from everyone and everyone can learn from me. What those things are different. I might be able to teach someone one thing and they will teach me something completely different. what we learn from each other isn't always in the sense of academia. It isn't always like in an academic sense. It isn't always teacher student, right? It's not that dynamic. Experience teaches. Experience with people, learning from their experience, their decisions, their choices, their regrets, right? That is growth. Enlightenment has become a very irritating term to me because of how people handle it these days, right? And when we look at enlightenment through the Luciferian lens or the Luciferian perspective, enlightenment is not about light, but about seeing through the illusion of light itself. Illumination includes the shadow, the forbidden knowledge, dangerous insight. We understand the balance that enlightenment has because of the duality and spectrum existence of light and dark, right? In the occult world, and especially the left-hand path, we've always rejected the light, good, dark, bad binary. We've always fought against that. But for some reason, in recent times, we've rebranded the shit to light is as safety and dark as ignorance. And that's the game we're falling into now. Which is why we're having such a big crop up of these people that call themselves light workers. It's like, you know, even back in the day, I remember learning about all this shit when Wicca was like kind of like the alternative path in the occult and not kind of like the mainstay. And even in Wicca rejected so many concepts and so many ideas of, you know, what it is that we believe in today, simply because they broke everything down into binaries. White magic, black magic, light, dark, good, evil. They had all of the same tropes and concepts that Christianity did. And I suppose that that's why so many people so easily assimilated to Wicca, because they didn't have to completely sacrifice everything that they believed to be true. Wicca was Christianity, but with the promise of power. A Hollywood type. And that broke down over time. People realized that the craft is just a fucking movie. Glamour isn't about, you know, magically changing your hair color, your eye color, making people see things that don't exist. But for your ability to use your own personality, your own charisma in the execution of that ability. And so with that, Wicca kind of held on to the monopoly. And then from Wicca, so many people got tired of Wicca. Wicca became a meme of sorts. Already any Wiccans out there, but did. And that wasn't your fault, but it was definitely the fault of the many that, you know, practiced it. And so from there, people broke off and still refused to break away from that Abrahamic binary of good, evil. And so then you have now the light workers. The light workers are the same answer as the Christians and the Wiccans. At least the Wiccans that tried to standardize magic, right? Like, Tyra and I are making a school called Witch Skills. It's not about standardizing magic. It's about standardizing information, right? It's about going through actual history of everything. And then you can make your own choices. Like what you want to put together, what you don't want to put together. right? It's about, actually, Wyatt, welcome. How are you, man? It's about learning the history, practicing the history. It's all good. It's all good. And then by the end of it, being able to produce, right? Being able to do something. And then you create your own path. You do your own thing. It's not about teaching you a path. It's not about, giving you a certificate saying, yes, you are powerful. No, that's bullshit. It's saying you understand the history. You've learned what the history is. You've gone through, each section of the history, and it's broken down by pantheon and then, region. So there are, for example, if you look at Norsemen, right, the Norse pagan pantheon, many people look at the Norse pagan pantheon as just one pantheon for that region, but there were different subregions that had variations of Norse paganism. All kind of falls into the same bracket, but there were variations. And we believed in structuring of witch skills that it was important to talk about those variations. 12-hour work shifts. Oh, Jesus Christ. I am so sorry. I mean, I work 9 hours, I think it is, a day, and that kicked my ass. So that was the structuring of witch skills. Because of the fact that, both Dyer and I generally kind of detest the idea of people saying, that you need to be a part of an order, or, you need to, graduate from some type of fucking mysticism school in order to, be considered, an actual witch. It's bullshit. Like, witch skills isn't about, you don't need to go through witch skills. You can never touch witch skills. You can never go near it. There'll be a witch. Like, you don't need us to tell you you're a witch. The only thing that witch skills does is give you an education in the history of witchcraft, the craft, magic, paganism from regional perspective, different types of spiritualities, and then how those kind of blended together and how they're used and things like that. Like, I am not of the mindset of, for example, like, witches can't smudge. Right? I think that that's so fucking stupid. Like, I think the whole cultural appropriation thing is fucking retarded. It's cultural appreciation. It's like you find something that works, you find something that functions magically or personally or whatever, and you want to, assimilate that into your being. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It is cultural appreciation, right? We all have something to offer one another, right? To sit there and say that because you're not Native American means that you can't smudge, right? Like, is just I'm not doing this morning. Bye. So, I think enlightenment is a myth. At least in my experience, there's a change that happens in people once they see it. But what is it? What is it? What is enlightenment? I mean, what does it include? What does it exclude? Are we talking philosophical enlightenment? Are we talking spiritual enlightenment? Personal enlightenment? What is enlightenment? For the church, enlightenment was one thing. For when we went through, you know, the whole age of reason, enlightenment became something else. It fell into the sciences and academics and government, the shedding of superstition. And so that's kind of where the whole myth of enlightenment comes in, because enlightenment is different depending on who you talk to. And everyone wants to claim right and control over what enlightenment is and claim that they have the one true path to enlightenment. This is enlightenment. That I'm enlightened. What? By what standard? By what existence? Am I right? We treat enlightenment as a noun, thing, as a thing to obtain. Is until they experience it, and therefore not be taught, only experienced. It can differ from individual to individual. See, I believe enlightenment is an action. To be enlightened. Right? So, to live an enlightened life. I don't think enlightenment is gulp. Don't think it ever should be a gulp or something to obtain. Because you can't. Enlightenment, I feel, is the same idea as the perfectionist. Right? Worry not for perfection, shall you never obtain it. True enlightenment, that phrase, true enlightenment, changes, it evolves, it moves. But here's the thing. If enlightenment varies on personal experience, that makes enlightenment subjective. Therefore, we cannot create an objective definition of what enlightenment is. If we can't create an objective definition of what enlightenment is, then we cannot speak to enlightenment or the ability to reach it. Because it is subjective, not objective. Because there are subjective ideas that describe what enlightenment is or is not. About the experience of a divine higher perspective. Call it an action to see through your eyes. It's difficult to explain. Just understanding. Well, that's one way of looking at it, but those that, like, when we look at, like, the history of the Illuminati, and we want to talk about, not in the tinfoil hat sense of what the Illuminati is, but what the Illuminati actually was during the time, the church had its primary control over everything, and, refused to accept the sciences and mathematicians and things of that nature. Those people that were in the Illuminati that, forced forward, in silence and, things like that, of their studying and, all of that, trying to push forward academics. They believed themselves to be enlightened. Church thought very much the opposite. Objectivity. More like a state of being. I agree with that statement. Why? I do believe that enlightenment is a state of being. Because enlightenment evolves, it changes, it is subjective. It is subjective. Many things in life are subjective. Most things in life are subjective. However, here's the one thing, right? I do not like to use. I am one of those people that I believe in the meaning of words. In truth, Truth is objective. There can only be one objective truth. Truth is based on facts. There can only be objective facts. There cannot be subjective facts. That's a fact for some people, but not for others. That defeats the purpose, rhyme, and reason of facts and truth. Subjectivity inside of reality, inside of our existence, a subjective existence, the subjective ideas that work for us. Because I think the idea here is when we look at truth, I think we're trying to bend the meaning of what the meaning of truth is. And there cannot be a subjective truth. There can only be objective truth, because truth can only exist in a place where facts support it, which is what makes it true, right? So, and I do appreciate you putting it in quotes, Kesra. I do appreciate that. Because it kind of, it shows that you're of the same mindset. Or at least similar. So when it comes to enlightenment cannot, if enlightenment is ever evolving, ever changing, difference between subjective and objective, both real, different from each other, but of the same source. Realism. We got another one coming through. So what's the function of the myth, right? Why the myth persists? How it maintains power, right? So every culture needs a myth to justify authority. So if we look at the medieval myth, we're looking at divine order, right of kings. The Enlightenment myth there is the rational order, the right of experts. Enlightened societies began to worship intellect, productivity, and progress. Human worth reduced to utility. Emotions, instincts, mysticism labeled primitive or dangerous. Right? Adorno and Horkheimer, again, right? Enlightenment is totalitarian. It seeks to categorize everything, even the soul, under logic. The Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, logic, birthed machines and efficiency, but also exploitation, colonialism, and mechanized war. Wellness Enlightenment in the modern mirror, spiritual influencers, shadow work, influencers, life coaches, preaching light and positivity, while selling submission to algorithmic culture. Jungian contrast here is Jung taught integration, not escape. Enlightenment tries to erase shadow. Individuation demands we face it. Lucifer represents active illumination, while the Enlightenment represents passive acceptance of predefined light. Well, that's the subjective aspect of it, Matt, right? Is how you define enlightenment. If you want to define your enlightenment based on awareness, then so be it. That's the thing with enlightenment, is it had in Eastern cultures an objective ideal that most people agreed on throughout the East. Western society took it and made people drink Kool-Aid. If you get that reference, congratulations. If you don't, I don't think YouTube will let me explain it. So Hacks, promises, and pitfalls. The illusion of liberation. How every light comes with a leash. Right? The Enlightenment promised freedom through reason, equality through progress, morality through rational ethics. All three collapsed under their own hypocrisy. Freedom through reason, rational systems still serve whoever controls them. Capitalism justified by natural market laws. Capitalism is an amazing concept. I'm not an anti-capitalist, but I do not believe in uncontrolled, unprotected capitalism. Capitalism is a consumer market. It is not a market that is supposed to be designed for the company, though in its current form it is. Capitalism, the concept, the base idea of capitalism has always been make a product, you make a good product, people buy your product, you make money. You make a new product, you fuck up on that product, it's a bad product, nobody buys it, you lose money. When the government gets involved and starts throwing bailouts at people because they fuck up just to keep the business floating, that's wrong. That shouldn't happen. That's not what capitalism is. It's what we made it. Science used to rationalize eugenics and colonialization. Equality through progress. Progress created hierarchy of intelligence, culture, and race. Morality through reason. Morality detached from empathy becomes cold utilitarianism. Spiritual mirror on this. Modern new age and mindful industries, you must transcend your ego. Another control mechanism disguised as wisdom. In reality, they train people to suppress individuality for collective peace. So I beg the Luciferian alternative here. Embrace ego, but master it. Enlightenment suppresses. Luciferian illumination refines. So the pitfall for those chasing light often fear shadow. That fear makes them manipulatable. True sovereignty means facing what the light hides. So this is where I come off on saying the myth of enlightenment. Thanks, Satan. I saw it through the transcend your ego bullshit early on in my journey. Unfortunately, a lot of us didn't. I fell for it for a while there when I was first getting into this shit, and I was like, how the fuck do you do this? And it's like, you can't, and that's the point, right? That's the point, to have people chasing. And I'm not here like, here's the thing. I want something to be clear here. I'm not telling you that enlightenment doesn't exist. I'm not telling you that your idea of what enlightenment is can't be real. I'm not shutting that down. Not the attempt here. What I'm saying is what this is a comment on, and I think, like, unfortunately, a lot of people are going to take this very literally. And it's going to be a fun time in the fucking comment section. But I don't mean literal in a literal sense that enlightenment is a myth in its current form. Yeah, I do. I do think it's a myth. I think enlightenment has turned into this thing that people chase. It's marketable. It's something that people buy, quite literally, right? Everyone wants to buy the next book that promises them to be enlightened. And I think all of you are correct in one way or another. It is something that you experience. It's not something that you can buy or purchase or, become, involved, become involved in an external way. You can't chase it directly. It just kind of happens. You either get there and feel that way or you don't. And it is very much so, on the spectrum of you know, momentary enlightenment. I have moments in my life where I feel very enlightened, but it's not something that, like, persists consistently and constantly, through every facet of my life. There's sometimes I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about something and the light bulb goes on. And I'm like, oh, no shit. That was an enlightened moment. And I think that enlightenment is just that. It is enlightened moments of existence where we understand something that we previously didn't. We've become enlightened on something. But I don't, which is what feeds to the point that I made, that it is an action, right? Um, Teeth, not really. Though most of us think it's somebody's bullshitting somebody. There's too many holes to it, too much stuff that doesn't make sense. Those ha moments are amazing, aren't they? Like, aha, I got it. Uh, and they happen on a spectrum. Sometimes it's a spiritual thing, sometimes it's a mathematical thing, right? Those enlightened moments happen, right? Okay, there's a good definition. Enlightenment is the wisdom you gain from ego death, with ego being defined as your experience of reality and yourself as the experience. I don't think it needs a definition, though. That's the thing. Like that I think that's the point, right? So me asking what the definition is wasn't because I really wanted you to try to give me one, because if we try to define enlightenment, we fall into the same bad pattern that we fell into that I'm talking about here now, where enlightenment is used to control, right? It is used in, systems of control, of submission. So I don't believe that enlightenment should ever have a definition. And I do believe that it needs to be subjective. And I believe that there needs to be an understanding that enlightenment for one is not enlightenment for another. Because if you're enlightened about one thing that I don't give a shit about, then I don't give a fuck if you're enlightened by it. And I don't want to be enlightened by it because I don't give a shit. And vice versa. If I'm enlightened about computers and technology and programming and binary code, and I know how computers communicate with each other, and I can see the dangers of AI and stuff like that, and there's somebody else that just doesn't give a fuck about those things, then what purpose does my enlightenment serve? Nothing. Zero. At least to that person. To me, everything. To that other person, fuck all. The problem happens is when we try to define enlightenment, when we try to define it as a thing or a process and then force it onto other people, and then to sit there and say, you're not enlightened because you're not enlightened in the same way that I'm enlightened. Not everything needs a definition. We can define the enlightened experience, which we already have. It's essentially aha moments in life, right? But enlightenment in and of itself shouldn't have a definition. It shouldn't be, and it's if you need to force a definition on it, you can say that it is definitionless, that it's different for every person, that the point of enlightenment to which you reached is depending on what it is you are trying to be enlightened on. Because we try to use the term enlightenment as a catch-all phrase, that you are enlightened, meaning that you are like an absolute at absolute level. Right? And by that definition, by the definition of how enlightenment is used, the only thing that can be enlightened at all is God. Because God, the Christian God, is the only absolute, right? Is in Christianity, their God is the absolute everything. So the only thing that can be truly enlightened by the definition of what enlightenment usually is or how it is used in modern society, the only thing that can be enlightened is the Christian God. Us as human beings, to become enlightened is to die, is death, to cease to exist. Because at that point, then we become one with the God source. So integration and equality. Or the semantics of the process? Kind of both. So the way that I broke this down, right, is the Lucifer's illumination, right? So illumination is confrontation with self, not conformity to truth. You don't receive light, you ignite it. Enlightenment tells you what to think. Illumination teaches you to think. If we look at Belial, we look at grounding. Rational progress has no anchor in lived truth. Grounding means taking responsibility for your will, not outsourcing ethics to institutions. We look at Lilith for liberation. The myth of enlightenment demands obedience to ideals. Lilith refuses obedience. Her liberation is rebellion. Asmodeus is desire. Enlightenment moralizes desire, calls it primitive. Desire is divine fire. We master it. We don't erase it. Leviathan is depth. Rationality fears chaos. Leviathan swims in it. The abyss is not ignorance. It's potential unmeasured by human systems. Baphomet is integration, the true synthesis of light and dark. Enlightenment seeks purity. Baphomet teaches balance. So the application here, how you coach or guide others shedding external cult, light cults, right? How you, as the practitioner, can push that forward. Awakening is owning all facets of self, not erasing the ones that scare others. So in the modern idea of what enlightenment is, when we look at enlightenment and what this conversation is about, is the idea of people using the term enlightenment to attack others for believing what they believe in. Christians do it all the time. They believe that they're enlightened through God and Jesus, and they come in here with their Christ is King bullshit because they're enlightened, because they feel enlightened through God and the church. An atheist will come and shut us down for being theistic because they are enlightened to the truth that spiritual belief is fallacy. It's fairy tales. It doesn't work. It doesn't function. Not scientific. Can't be seen. This is my attack on enlightenment. Because if you go to each group, people, everyone will define enlightenment differently. And if you do not sit in the throne of that group's enlightenment and agree with their concept of enlightenment, you will be ostracized from that group. I have never, ever described myself as enlightened because I think it's bullshit. I think we can be aware We can be illuminated. We can have understandings, but based on how enlightenment is used, how it's brought forth, how people, are told by one enlightened group that they're not enlightened because it's not the same enlightenment. Enlightenment has created a system. All the Christians, Muslims, Jews, and all the other people, faith kill each other for the same ideals and the same invisible sky daddy. And they all claim to be enlightened. they do. Like, at the end of the day, they all claim to be enlightened. Right? They all claim that term. So, what replaces enlightenment once it's dismantled? Like, once we kind of dismantle the idea of enlightenment, how do we, what replaces it, if anything? Right? Is that a rhetorical question, Wyatt? Or are you actually looking for an answer? I'm being honest, because I know there's sometimes you're like, just ignore me and let me type. So I don't know if you want to be a part of the conversation or you're just kind of throwing it out there. But that, for them being saved, that is their enlightenment. Right? They are enlightened to that belief. Greasap, welcome. Good to see you. It is rhetorical, but kind of the answer. So we as human beings experience everything, right? We experience the mundane and the material, and we take spirituality, we make it mundane and material. And we experience that. We experience everything materialistically. And we have a hard time trying to experience anything outside of that, outside of the materialistic experience. So we have to bring everything down to our level. Right? So even in spirituality, when we go into that experience and want to feel that experience, that we bring it down to materialistic being, which is one of the reasons why, when we look at the Satanic Bible and we talk about LaVey and we talk about the psychodrama and we talk about, ritual being psychodrama, it is bringing that spiritual experience down into the materialistic world. It is taking it from the ether and putting it in front of us to experience it, as a psychodrama. Receive a higher realization. But the belief that they are saved is the higher realization. That's the thing. That is where their enlightenment lies. Right? Their enlightenment is reliant on the realization that they are saved by Jesus Christ. And through Jesus Christ, they are eternal. Right? Maeve, hail. So, again, the question, right? What replaces enlightenment once it's dismantled? Once we kind of dismantle the modern idea of enlightenment, that bloody word, right? The Enlightenment myth fails because it externalizes salvation in God, reason, or progress. Right? The infernal path replaces that with sovereign ethics. Morality is self-forged, not inherited. Your responsibility is proportional to your awareness. The serpent said, "You shall not surely die." Enlightenment began in defiance, not obedience. Right? So, ethical pillars for the infernal mind, right? Do not outsource truth. Do not worship illumination. Use it. Do not seek purity, seek power balanced by awareness. Solve et coagula, dissolve the illusion, rebuild the self. Be wary of nihilism, right? Rejecting enlightenment does not mean rejecting reason. It means reclaiming it from its cult. Sovereignty means you decide when to use light, when to dwell in the shadow. And again, I'll reiterate the point. I'm not saying enlightenment doesn't exist. Like, I'm not, like, that's not the point that I'm fighting against. And I think that keeps getting kind of lost in translation here. You know, but I am saying that enlightenment is a term that is used to control people, to control direction, to control ideas, to control outlooks, to control action, right? To tell people that they can and can't do this, that this isn't enlightened. This is enlightened. Do this if you want enlightenment. Don't do this or you shall never reach enlightenment, right? It's enlightenment. Though the Christian, when saved, is enlightened in the idea that Jesus Christ is their Savior and that they are immortal and forever living through their Savior, enlightenment is in equal standing with the idea of being saved in many groups. Where does the outside begin and the inside end? Whether it's a higher power or it's your own divinity, your black flame, if you want to call it that, there's two sides of the same coin. Well, so we talked about the coin here. We talked about the coin previously. And I think that this was Friday's episode is when we talked about this, right? Definition. Exactly, Kesra. Exactly. The Kesra got it. Kesra got it. Right, that's a bit assholic of me. I'm sorry. But you did get it. You do get it. So here's the thing with the two-sided coin thing, right? So the reason why we say two sides of the coin is we say two sides of the coin, the same object, but it's two sides that never meet. But that's not true, is it? Because if something has two sides or two halves, then those two halves have their own sides. So therefore, the coin, though the sides we are able to see don't touch, the two halves do. Right? Because a side has a front and back. Even though you can't see the back, you can only see the face of it. So the whole coin concept is it's a great analogy, but we use it in the sense of duality, right? We use the two sides of the same coin, that we use that analogy to describe and define duality, right? Light and dark, good and evil, right? Safe and unsafe, right? So, and we say that we use that analogy when we talk about, like, you know, the day and the night, right? It's two sides of something that are always joined, that exist simultaneously, but they never touch. But they do. We just don't see where they touch. Because where they touch, if we took that coin and we turned it into kind of like a slinky, we pull it out, that becomes a spectrum, right? And every piece is connected to the previous piece. And they're constantly touching. They're always touching. Same thing, two sides. Those two sides, those two extremes don't touch. But they touch everywhere else. They touch inside of the spectrum aspect of it. And so the way that I broke down this concept and this idea in the last show was When we look at this, when we look at these two sides, when we look at the internal, the external, and if we're talking about internal, external, and the same concept of duality as when we look at light and dark, or good and evil, or compassion and cruelty, they exist within a spectrum. We have the extremes, but they exist within that spectrum of existence. And the thing that needs to be realized is that in that slinky analogy of the coin being pulled apart, we still have those two extremes. We always exist in that spectrum, but that spectrum, unification of the spectrum, unification, integration of the shadow and the ego brings it together, centers it. The spectrum's not gone. Just because it's together, just because we didn't pull it apart, the spectrum doesn't cease to exist. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean that it ceases to exist because you're unable to perceive it. And we understand this through our own analogies. The very analogies that we use to create the polarization or the extreme of existence. I use compassion and cruelty. You can use whatever you want, light and dark, good and evil. We're never fully on one side or the other. We're always kind of bouncing back and forth, right? Sometimes it takes a little longer to get to one side than it does to get to the other or whatever, but we're always in existence inside of that. So we have two sides to a coin. Most definitely we do. We have two extremes. In your case, in this case of this comment, we have internal, external. But there is a spectrum that still exists on that. And we're constantly moving and flowing. There's an ebb and flow to that existence. So the idea and the concept of the two sides of the same coin is that there's two sides of the same coin, forever joined but never touching, never meeting. But that's not true. The extremes might not meet, but they're always met. Always. Regardless of how you look at it. Right? In the metaphor too seriously, I'm saying whether it's Sky Daddy or it's yourself, it's a matter of perspective. The difference between brightness and darkness. It's of them. So where does the perspective come from? Where does the perspective come from? The perspective comes from that same duality. It comes from that same metaphor. Your understanding of perspective comes from the same metaphor. You can't have perspective without having a predetermined idea of what that perspective is. That perspective can't exist unless somebody already told you what that perspective is. And then assimilated that knowledge into your own existence. So the difference between brightness and darkness, we can say is, we can say that the difference between brightness and darkness is in your eye. Sure, I agree with that. Where does that come from, though? What if we reverse it? What if we reverse all societal norms and we say that brightness is darkness and darkness is brightness? So by definition, does it reverse it or does it stay the same? Obviously, I would say it stays the same. It's just a different definition. But your perspective on what something is, whether it is light or dark or good or evil, or compassionate or cruel, or internal or external, that perspective, because if and I'm kind of being a dick here, right? Like this, don't take what I'm saying literally. I'm trying to make a point, right? We can, for all intents and purposes, we can do this dance. And this isn't, I'm not upset with you, Wyatt, or even upset. I'm in the conversation. That's all. We can do this dance where we can break everything down, because there comes a point where we have to stop breaking shit apart and accept it for what it is. Metaphorically a dick, not a literal dick. Exactly. Right? That is someone who is for salvation. You're doing a lot of externalization of forces, not trying to upset anyone. That no worries. So you use the external. It's stimulus, right? It's stimulus. It's literal stimulus. It's psychological. It's a psychological process. Psychodrama, right? I externalize my faith, my belief, my understanding of things in ritual and things like that to better internalize my view of myself and to look inside. I'm one that believes that each individual human being is a vast universe of existence. And within the connection of self, you are able to connect to the things that are external to yourself. Externalization and internalization, again, we're talking about that duality, that dynamic. We exist on that spectrum, right? I cannot wholly all the time internalize, and I can't wholly all the time externalize. It has to have a balance. It has to have an ebb and flow. It has to go back and forth, right? Internally for salvation, I don't think there is salvation. I don't think we need saving. I wouldn't agree with that one because I don't believe that we need saving. I think looking for salvation is to say that my existence is inherently wrong. And I don't believe that it is. At any rate, anywhere. Right? And we know that the universe exists internally of ourselves and externally of ourselves. That we can know. There's an internal universe and there's an external universe. Well, to keep things simple, I begin at my conception and I end at my death. And my environment is constantly changing. As far as the experience of light and dark, if we're using light and dark in terms of good and evil, right? I don't have an experience of light and dark. I just have what I've been told. And then from what I was told, then I begin to accumulate experience in those things, in those facets. But at the beginning, our experience is dictated by what we're told. We're afraid of the dark because we're told that there's monsters in the dark. We're told that there is a parallel between darkness and evil. And so for all of us, most of us, our beginning experience isn't actually our own experience, but a manipulation of experience that we live through and we have to decode, deconstruct, and break down. Much like everything else in existence, we have to break it down to re-experience it and come up with our own definitions of what these things are and are not to us. But I can tell you as a child, my initial experience of darkness was fear. But was that my experience or was that someone else's experience or was that a forced experience? Because that wasn't from me. That fear didn't come from an inherent fear of the dark. It came from a programmed fear of the dark. So was that me? I beg to say that it wasn't. That was someone else's interpretation, someone else's direction. So we are an accumulation of not only our own experiences, but other people's experiences as well. And this is, again, where we get into the myth of enlightenment. Much like what Kesra put down, Kesra broke it down wonderfully to say that the definition is controlled to control people. I'm paraphrasing. And many things in life, in our existence, are controlled for that reason to control us. The whole concept, if we look at, for example, in Mexican culture, if we look at La Llorona, La Llorona is used to make kids go to sleep, because if they don't go to sleep, La Llorona is going to get you. The boogeyman's going to get you. Have brainwashed the masses into believing that light, dark, are none of it is true. 100%. The weeping woman, huh? So our experiences, some of them are ours and some of them aren't. Because if you're told something, if you're told that death is bad and death is an inevitable part of life, and you live in fear of death, your experience of life will be that of fearing death. And every action you do or do not take is from the fear of the inevitable. Darkness is an inevitability. Knowing thyself truthfully is enlightenment, at least in my view. I like that. I like that. Know thyself. Enlightenment should have never been an external thing. Enlightenment should never have been something that is used to control people. Like I said, in this day and age, enlightenment has turned into something that makes people drink Kool-Aid. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that reference, but if you know the reference, congratulations. You get what I'm talking. Bye-bye. Trinity, bye. Thank you for being here. You get the reference? Good. I'm glad. And anything that is so enlightened to make you take such an action, that's not enlightenment. That's manipulation. That's control. Too many will announce enlightenment in order to feel superior. Exactly. 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 100%. 100%. So again, I'll repeat the last part that I mentioned here for our ethics and sovereignty. Sovereignty means you decide when to use light, when to dwell in shadow. And Well, here's the thing. I think the problem with that question is when people try, like when people try to make philosophy on something that isn't, that doesn't need to be philosophical. So there are different stages to everything, right? So there's this life that I'm living. I'm living my life. I am present for my life and I enjoy my life. And, I'm grateful for the life that I have and the things that I have and the people that I have around me. Death doesn't have a beginning or an end. That's something, and if it does, it's something that we can't know. That is an assumption. You cannot know that life has a beginning, death has a beginning and an end. Death is the end of life, and death is absolute. I'm not saying that there isn't something after this. I'm saying that I can't tell you for certain that there is or is not, because the only way to know is to die. It's the ultimate gag order, right? It's the ultimate fucking gag. Death is the ultimate gag order, right? Death is the ultimate NDA, the non-disclosure agreement. Because we can sit here and we can dance and we can parry all we want about what is or isn't, and the beginning and the end of death. But the only way to truly know is to die. And due to death's permanence, we can't come back and say what we experienced, which is very important to look at people that have NDEs. They don't have death experiences. They have near-death experience. And for many, it's very similar. For some, it's very different. But death as an experience is absolute. So we don't know if we really experience death or if death is just a state of being. I started at my conception. But see, this is assuming that it's a loop around. Wyatt, you're assuming that it goes in a circle. You're assuming that death needs to happen for life to begin. And so therefore, the beginning of a new life is the end of a death. But at the end of whose death? Because I can tell you, from my understanding between all of the esoteric and the metaphysical and the sciences, that me, who I am, Adius Dade, sitting here before you today, is not a spiritual experience. It's a mundane one. It's a materialistic one. It's up here. It's in my mind. My brain is the definition of who I am. My experiences, my lack thereof experiences, nature and nurture, that's what makes Adius Dade Adius Dade. In death, the physicality, the physical body, ceases to exist. It changes form. It returns to the earth from whence it came, at least in some ideas. So me, as who I am today, upon my death, I don't return. So I begin at my conception and I end at my death. Wherever that might be. What happens after death? We don't know. But birth, conception, birth, isn't proof that death has an end. Life has an end. We can define that. We cannot define beyond a reasonable doubt that birth is proof that death has an end. We can't. We can't prove the secular existence, the connection, especially because there's significantly more births than there are deaths. It's not like a situation where when someone dies, someone is born. At the current rate, that we're populating the earth and how long it is taking for people to die, life is a psychedelic trip that death is having. Okay, there you go. Right? So, yeah, let's that's the line I needed. So, yeah, with that being said, that is going to be today's episode of Satan and Coffee. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys got something out of it. I knew that this was going to be a fun one. I knew that this was going to be one where we weren't all going to be in perfect agreement on what the hell's going on with it, which is why I chose it. Just off in a room. Weed for like 10 days. That's how I got here. There you go. You guys are fucking amazing. You're the reason I keep doing this. So we always end as we began. We reject the Trinity, we reject the baptism of John, and we reject the baptisms of the Spirit. And as always, hail thy fucking self. We'll see you in the next one. Peace the fuck out, everybody.